On the 28th of June 1969, police raided the Stonewall Inn in New York. This sparked an uprising that lasted 6 days and started events that led to the changed perception of the LGBTQ plus community for many people. It wasn't the first police raid against a gay bar, and it wasn't the first time the community fought back against it, but it was the first to spark a multiple-day rebellion on a scale as large as it was against how the community was treated. Although many sources will describe it as a riot, I, out of respect for the community, will not refer to it as a riot, and will instead refer to it as a rebellion or uprising, because many Stonewall veterans have come out to say that they do not like the use of the term. To understand just how truly important Stonewall was, you have to look into the context of the time period it took place in. At the time, the LGBTQ plus community was heavily oppressed, and in 1970, which even though that was after Stonewall, it still is irrelevant to what happened before it. In 1970, the Gay Liberation Front established 3 principal types of homosexual oppression. The first of those was the oppression from society caused by ignorance, fear of the unknown, and lack of exposure. This is shown by the stereotypes about homosexuals, such as how they were seen as weaker than straight people, and how many perceived homosexuality as equal to pedophilia, and also even shown in how homosexuality was classified as a mental illness. The media also continued this negative portrayal. For example, a New York Times article made in March 1960 is named Life on W42nd Street, a Study in Decay. This article is about the problems on that area, and it points out things such as crime and uncleanliness, but it also mentions homosexuals as an obvious problem. It mentions homosexuality as a behavior pattern that is against the law, and describes a quote-unquote certain type of homosexual, describing them as the quote-unquote flagrant devices, those who wear makeup, a feminine hairdo, and walk with a switch. The lack of queer representation at the time led to many queer people not knowing that there are others like them, as well as leading many to not even know they were queer at all. To quote Mark Segal, many people like myself who are living outside of New York thought there were no gay people living anywhere else because in 1969, basically we were invisible. You didn't see us on TV, you didn't see us on the radio, you didn't see us in magazines. The second principal type of oppression the Gay Liberation Front listed was psychological oppression. Psychological oppression includes things such as internalized homophobia, homosexuals feeling as if they were sick or perverted, unable to accept themselves and their identity, and sexism from one homosexual to another within the queer community. The third and final principal form of oppression the Gay Liberation Front states is legal oppression and discriminatory practices from the government. There have been many practices from the government in history that have discriminated against the LGBTQ plus community. For example, sodomy laws criminalized consensual same-sex sexual interactions. They also criminalized some heterosexual interactions, but it was rarely enforced on them. And the homosexual sodomy laws were usually removed much later than heterosexual laws. For example, Texas decriminalized consensual sodomy among 2 members of opposite sex in 1974, but only decriminalized homosexual consensual sodomy in 2003. Anti-cross-dressing laws, also known as masquerade laws, have also been used to harm the queer community. Even though not all cross-dressers are queer, they were commonly outcasts that were in queer spaces at the time. In 1848, there was a law prohibiting citizens presenting themselves publicly in a dress not belonging to his or her sex in Ohio. The same law was later passed in San Francisco in 1863. These laws were in the category of a wider law that criminalized public indecency such as public nudity and were created to reinforce the two-gender system during the American frontier. Even though those are very old laws, it's important to remember that even in cases where that law wasn't being used at the time, the law of public indecency was commonly used by officers to discriminate against cross-dressers. Another law used to harass cross-dressers is the law of appearing under disguise, which was originally made to stop people from committing crimes whilst under disguise and unable to be identified. Police officers would commonly hold this law against cross-dressers using the justification that dressing in a way more common to the opposite sex is a quote-unquote disguise. Mistreatment from the law in general led to the creation of gay bars, a safe place for queer people most of the time. Gay bars in New York were commonly refused a liquor license by the New York State Liquor Authority, which led to many running without a liquor license. The mafia would provide the alcohol for sale since they didn't care about who they got the money from. These two things were what police used to justify a raid. That being said, liquor license and mafia members are the only things that have to do with the owners and the mafia, but regular patrons were still arrested in these raids. It's important to know how common the gay bar raids were. The Stonewall raid wasn't the first gay bar raid or even the first Stonewall suffered. A couple examples of prior gay bar raids are the Pepper Hill Club raid in 1955 and the Compton's Cafeteria raid in 1966. A raid would usually include cross-dressers being escorted into the bathrooms by officers to check their sex, leading to arrests, patrons being arrested and often hospitalized, and there would commonly be people fighting back, but none of them got as much attention as Stonewall, because the Stonewall Inn was one of the most popular gay bars in New York. It was also cheaper than most gay bars in the area and was welcoming to many different kinds of people. To quote Mark Segal, especially if you were young, if you were a runaway, if you were trans, if you were new to the city, that's where you went. Patrons would commonly visit multiple times a night. It was an important location for the queer people in New York. If you were queer, you could find a small community of people similar to yourself that accepted you as you are. Raids on the Stonewall Inn were quite common, happening about once a month on average. To quote Naomi Moland, police would come into the bar, turn on the lights, make everyone line up, and then ask everyone to pull out their IDs. In fact, when the raid occurred on the 28th, the inn had already been raided once before that same week. The day that the Stonewall Inn was raided, about 200 people were in it. Commonplace things in police raids on gay bars occurred, such as sex checks and arresting patrons, but this time it was different. As the police officers hauled customers into police vehicles, there was a woman fighting attempts to be pushed into a vehicle, leading to her yelling, "Why don't you guys do something?" Suddenly, an already messy situation erupted into chaos. People chanted, "Gay power, we shall overcome," as the others threw bottles and bricks. It was a rebellion, and this time it didn't just stop the next day. To quote Patrick McCarthy, the foundation for the movement that emerges in fuller form in the wake of Stonewall was laid in the decades before in public and private battles in different organizations and through the work of many people. The popularity of the civil rights movement and Vietnam War protests at the time most likely led to inspiration amongst queer people. To quote Evelyn Hammonds, at the time of what we now call the Stonewall Rebellion, what was also happening was the second wave of the women's movement. And while there were lots of tensions in some women's organizations between lesbians and straight women, there was also a great deal of unity, and people were coming together around a shared desire for greater equality for women and gay people. So, many different actual, movements at the time, heavily, most likely inspired what ended up happening. The Stonewall Uprising led to queer people showing who they were as well, and showing that there were others like them more than most people thought there were at the time. To quote Naomi Moland, the interesting thing about the LGBT plus minority is that they're largely invisible, and so police and others were shocked that there were this many gay people who were out in the open. So you think of this term coming out as a powerful way in which suddenly the minority that was largely invisible became at that moment visible. The impact of the Stonewall Uprising was shown very quickly. Hundreds of people protesting in the streets, opposing the police that oppressed them, expressing their sexuality publicly for the first time. That's a difficult thing to ignore. Before Stonewall, the LGBTQ plus community didn't get much attention in the media, but this caused a lot of news coverage and political attention. The queer community was no longer quiet. Stonewall encouraged queer people to become more politically loud and have their voices heard. The violence of Stonewall played an important role in getting attention as well. Although many queer people at the time had different opinions about the use of violence, it is obvious that it drew a lot of attention. The shock of the onlookers and bystanders seeing what was happening in the streets, the shock of people reading about it, made it much more memorable. It also went against the stereotype that gay people were weak. It was a display of strength. It was showing people that queer people had more power than people originally thought they did. The Stonewall Uprising was the focus of many headlines, exposing even more people to what was happening. To quote Henry Baird, a member of the U.S. Army who read about Stonewall in newspapers while on duty, "My heart was filled with joy. I thought about what I had read frequently, but no one I had to discuss it with. Secretly within myself, I decided that if I should survive to come back stateside, I would come out as a gay person. Mere weeks afterwards, new LGBTQ plus organizations and newspapers were created, and though the social and legal perception of queer people didn't completely change in that moment, it was the start of a better future for the LGBTQ plus community, and one of the groups that helped in this was the Gay Liberation Front. The Gay Liberation Front was formed a month after Stonewall and was an organization of people who would march and protest for gay rights, and was one of the largest organizations for gay rights movements and queer political activism. To quote Mark Segal, the LGBTQ community didn't exist before Gay Liberation Front founded it. And what I mean by that is, if you take a look at what LGBT community and LGBT life was like before GLF, what you had was several gay organizations in major cities around the country being run by 2 or 3 people, and maybe they would have meetings where 10 or 20 people would show up. Then there were the gay bars that existed, and there was maybe a newsletter and public places where gay people met. That was the extent of it. What the Gay Liberation Front did, which was totally revolutionary, was we brought our community out into the streets. The first Pride March happened in 1970 on the 1-year anniversary of the Stonewall Rebellion. An estimated 3,000 to 5,000 people attended the march, and it started a tradition of annual Pride Marches. To quote Evelyn Hammonds, the marches were among the first highly visible public events for people to express their gay sexuality and for allies to have an opportunity to support gay people in their lives. Since the Stonewall Uprising, there have been many triumphs for LGBTQ plus rights, including the removal of sodomy laws, the decrease and eventual stopping of cross-dressing arrests, the removal of homosexuality from the American Psychiatric Association from their lists of mental illnesses, the legalization of same-sex marriage, and eventual federal legalization of same-sex marriage in 2015, and in general, a larger societal exception. To focus more on same-sex marriage, in 2015 the Supreme Court interpreted that the 14th Amendment of Equal Protection includes the rights of same-sex marriage and made it legal on a federal level, which has benefited the LGBTQ plus community heavily. For example, before it was federal law, same-sex marriage was legalized in Cambridge on May 17, 2004, which was the first area in the U.S. to legalize it. To quote Evelyn Hammonds, "We got married the first night you could. It was the most amazing thing to come out of the front door of City Hall and see Massachusetts Avenue just filled with people singing and yelling with joy that gay marriage was now legal." Nowadays, Stonewall is a national monument due to its importance in LGBTQ plus rights. Due to the marches in Stonewall, Pride Month takes place in June, and it is a month where LGBTQ plus rights are celebrated, and the history of queer fighting for those rights are honored. The Stonewall Rebellion started a large increase in the voice of queer people and their power and representation in society, and was an incredibly important event in LGBTQ plus history.